Hello, everyone. I'm Valerie Paley, Chief Historian of the New York Historical Society and Director of its Center for Women's History, the first such center within the walls of a major museum in the United States. I'm pleased to welcome you to a virtual adaptation of the center's robust Salon series of public programs, which brings together leaders, thinkers, writers, and practitioners of women's history. Our guests embrace an understanding of history writ large, which heeds and celebrates women's critical contributions to the nation's past. Before I begin tonight's discussion, I want to say thank you to all of our trustees, our Chairman's Council, and all of our members and other donors for your generosity. I would also like to acknowledge Joyce B. Cowan, as well as Diane Max and her late husband, Adam E. Max, champions of women's history and of our center. Your support allows New York Historical to continue to pursue our mission to make history matter. Our conversation tonight will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please be sure to use Q&A. After the presentation, we will field as many questions as time allows. Tonight's program will be informed by two very recent works of women's history: Elisabeth Israels Perry's After the Vote, Feminist Politics in LaGuardia's New York, and Martha Jones's Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All. This is a bittersweet occasion, as Liz Perry passed away in late 2018 at the very moment her book was being printed by Oxford University Press. After the Vote, went on to win the Herbert H. Lehman Prize for Distinguished Scholarship in New York History. We are so happy to have this opportunity to feature it. And now, our panelists. We are thrilled to welcome Vanguard's author, Martha S. Jones, to our virtual stage this evening. Professor Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor and Professor of History at the Johns Hopkins University. She is the author of Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, 2018, winner of the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award for the Best Book in Civil Rights History, the American Historical Association Littleton Griswold Prize for the Best Book in American Legal History, and the American Society for Legal History John Philip Reed Book Award for the Best Book in Anglo-American Legal History. Professor Jones currently serves as co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women's Historians and on the executive board of the Society of American Historians. Blanche Wiesen Cook is a distinguished professor of history and women's studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Among her many publications is a 3-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt that the New York Times Book Review hailed as monumental and inspired. She has also written extensively about international peace, freedom of information, revolutionary politics, and other subjects which expand the conventional understanding of what constitutes women's history. We are honored to have Professor Cook as a member of our scholarly advisory board for the Center for Women's History. Welcome. So, on the face of it, After the Vote and Vanguard are very different. Both books are grounded in different centuries, different places, different players, but both consider the challenges both Black and white women faced in the pursuit of political power. Do you describe some of these challenges to us?
Well, I can jump in and first say thank you to you, Valerie, for the honor of being here and for being in conversation with Blanche Cook. It's really a first for me, and I'm incredibly honored. So good evening, Blanche. It's wonderful to see you.
Wonderful to see you and Valerie.
And I'll try and dive in to say that, you know, in some ways, Professor Perry's book is so important because it does center on a place like New York, where I think for African-American women in politics, the circumstances contrast importantly to the center of the story I tell in Vanguard, which is about the disappointments of the 19th Amendment, about the ways in which the 19th Amendment does not combat or permit Black women to combat discriminatory laws or intimidation and violence. But I certainly do hint at the ways in which Black women then come to places, spaces, political cultures where, in essence, they can do an end run around disenfranchisement. One of those places is Washington, D.C., but part of what I learned from Professor Perry is what is possible in a city like New York also.
I think that what's so exciting about reading Elisabeth Israels Perry book now is the incredible organization of the women before and after suffrage. And the whole idea that we need each other, that we cannot succeed without each other, the notion that we need to organize, the goals of trooping for democracy, you know, shoulder to shoulder, go into every community and really build a movement. And that really is so highlighted and well done in Elisabeth's book. It is, as Alice Kessler Harris said in her blurb, it is quite simply a wonderful book. You know, it asks what happened to the powerful women who emerged from the suffrage movement, and she really tells us. So it's really exciting.
Well, in both of these narratives, I'm sorry, I interrupted you, Martha.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I just want to say, you know, and it's one of the things that I think this centennial year has given us an opportunity to do, right, which is to confront a lot of the myths that really substitute for history when it comes to the 19th Amendment. And so if my work was partly, importantly, about dispelling the myths that sort of surround where Black women stood in the wake of the 19th Amendment, this is a book that really challenges some misunderstandings about where American women more generally were in the wake of the amendment. And it turns out they are in the trenches doing politics in all the ways we might imagine. And it's really exciting.
Well, that's a great segue to my next question, which is how did women come to politics, and how is a woman defined as political? What is political work in both of these narratives?
You know, one of the ways that the suffragists came into power was through the settlement house movement. And so you have people like Jane Addams and Lillian Wald, and Eleanor Roosevelt worked in a settlement house. And then there are the clubs. So there's the settlement house movement. There's one of the groups that Elisabeth focuses on is the Equality League of self-supporting women, which starts with Rose Schneiderman and Harriet Stanton Blatch. And the goal is to recruit working women into the suffrage movement. So you have working women, the benefactors of the settlement house movement, of welfare. All of this is happening for the vote and immediately after the vote. And then there's the explosion of women going to law school. So you have, you know, that is really so important. And I was very impressed reading Elisabeth Perry's book by how many women went to Hunter College and then went to NYU Law School. So you have people like Crystal Eastman, who is really one of the founders of the ACLU. And I have to say, I'm very happy that Oxford has just reprinted my book on Crystal Eastman, because we need her. You know, we need that visionary activism. Her first work was dealing with occupational safety and health and all of the factory hideousness that was going on, and the impact of the Triangle Fire. So women are really organizing, and as I said, going door to door, block by block, as Eleanor Roosevelt would urge, to build movements for justice and peace and freedom.
You know, I think there's nothing like telling the story of voting rights through American women, including African American women, because the context of having been disenfranchised for so very long means that, as we've always known about women's history, it gives us a whole new perspective on what politics is. And so, the women I write about are coming out of, yes, out of clubs, they're coming out of YWCAs, they're coming out of civil rights organizations, the National Association of Colored Women. They are coming now out of this professionalizing moment. They're coming out of social work schools in New York City and elsewhere. But they already understand that politics has never been reducible, nor should it be reducible to the vote. And so for the women I write about, by the 30s, they are in Washington, and the game is patronage. Right? It is how to use federal appointments to get yourself to the table in an end run around disenfranchisement, and then use that then to bring Black women from across the country who have come up within this very complicated and varied political milieu to now to Washington, where they are really able by the 30s to redirect New Deal resources to African American communities. But this is, I think, an approach to politics that we have to, regrettably, but I think importantly, ascribe to women who had come of age without access to the ballot, who had been political for a very long time before they get the vote.
And the role of journalism. Who would you focus on in your book, Martha?
Well, for example, by the time we get to this era, there is the indomitable Charlotta Bass in Los Angeles, editing the California Eagle, really helping to breathe life into what the ballot means for women, Black and white, in California, where the vote has come relatively early as contrasted to many other places. And Bass's role is to continue to press on the meaning of what women's votes can mean. And what we know, of course, is sort of over the long stretch of her life, that also means that she is going to come under special scrutiny from Hubert Hoover and J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI. Yes, J. Edgar and the FBI, and will be in many ways pushed to become even more of a radical force that she was. The first Black American woman to run for the vice presidency in 1952 on the Progressive Party ticket.
That's great.
Let's talk for a minute about the 19th Amendment. Let's talk for a few minutes about the 19th Amendment. This past August was the centennial of its passage, removing sex as a barrier to the vote. And I think this has given us an opportunity to rethink the narrative, as you alluded to, Martha, to consider the fact that the suffrage amendment was not a triumphal end in and of itself, but really a step along the way, as it didn't extend the vote to all American women. So, Martha, in Vanguard, you write that for Black women, ratification of the 19th Amendment was not a guarantee of the vote, but it was a clarifying moment. So suffrage might have been one goal, but there were other pressing concerns. What were they?
Well, principally for African American women, the fight for federal anti-lynching legislation had always been a companion to the quest for what becomes a 19th Amendment. African American women understand for them that no federal amendment that eliminates sex as a voting criteria can realize them access to the ballot if violence, intimidation remain unchecked. They have watched, right, their husbands and their fathers be kept from the polls despite the 15th Amendment. So Black women must continue after 1920, now looking for federal legislation that will give teeth to the 15th and the 15th and the 19th Amendments. That will be 45 years later with the the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but as importantly now, a moment to really fuse women's concerns with men's concerns in the African American community, and what will become a shared struggle for voting rights that takes us to the modern civil rights era.
So a century later, in the 1920s and beyond, after the vote, Liz Perry illuminates these origins of the broader fight for women's equality and unity. And her narrative considers the perspective of New York City women who challenged energies into reform outside formal politics, but they also persevered in electoral politics. They failed to get elected to high office or city council, so this is what they had to do. And in their appointed political positions, these women effected significant changes at all levels, local, state, eventually federal. But and they very much influenced policies. What are some specific examples in Perry's book that stand out for you, Blanche?
You know, there really are so many. She deals with Frances Perkins and the rights of labor. She deals with Belle Moskowitz, who never ran for office, but really organized the women's division of the Democratic Party. And they start working on housing. I mean, the women who had been settlement house workers are working on affordable housing. And then a woman who is a great hero for us at this moment is Esther Lape. L-A-P-E. I always spell her name because there still is amazingly no biography of Esther Lape, who wanted there to be health care for everybody. And so there are women physicians and there are men physicians. I mean, the AMA lobbies healthcare for all, which begins to emerge in the 20s. It was supposed to be in the Social Security Act of 1935, and the AMA lobby it to death. And from 1935 to her death in 1982, Esther Lape is really the leading promoter with her various committees, the New York City Club, the League of Women Voters, all kinds of powerful organizations are supporting her to get health care, a universal health care program. The US is still the only industrial country that doesn't have a national health care program. So to look at this, which I spend a little bit of time on in my Eleanor Roosevelt book, but to look at this is, you know, it's still what we have to be doing. And then the whole question of justice. You know, there's the NAACP and the way the women of the suffrage movement, you know, it's from Mary White Ovington to, you know, Mary McLeod Bethune. I mean, the really powerful committee against discrimination, against segregation. I have to say that in 1963, I failed a literacy test because I was teaching at Hampton Institute, which is now Hampton University in Virginia. And 4 of us found out where the polling place was, and we went to register to vote. And 4 of us who were ABD at Hopkins and at Harvard, we all failed the literacy test. This was still possible into the 1960s. And now we look at, I mean, here we are again at this effort to disenfranchise as many people as possible all over the country. So, you know, the Civil War hasn't completely ended, and all of the needs to organize that these women give us, you know, such a clue as to how to do, and we need them now.
This is a wonderful segue to my next question, which is it how this building of political power among women happened in the 19th century. You know, they found it where they could, and you make a wonderful case for kind of reperiodizing this 1848 moment of Seneca Falls, Martha, and recalibrate this sort of piece, this narrative of women's history and activism. And you start instead of 1848, a little bit earlier, with Joanna Lee, the first woman authorized to preach by the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Tell us about her and the idea of how recalibrating the notion of activism for women's rights to earlier 1848 works for you.
Thank you. You know, one of the lessons that comes out of, for me, African-American women's history is the need to attend to women's ideas as well as their activism. And so for me, I went searching for the origins of the core political critique, the core political vision that African-American women bring to the fore across, really, we might say until today, but across 2 centuries. And that is the view that neither race nor sex should arbitrate political rights and political power in the United States. And, you know, today my students think they invented that idea, just, I'll say that. And so we have to take them back, and, you know, and there's an important moment in the 1980s where scholars like Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins give us the analytic framework that we today refer to as intersectionality. But I went, in a sense, looking for the roots of intersectionality as a political philosophy. And it turns out that by the 18 teens and 20s, African-American women in church, at the pulpit, at the podium in politics, and with their pens in journalism are already developing and refining that critique that will be a lonely critique for most of our history to level. It will be a lonely vision to champion. And yet this is why I begin with somebody like Joanna Lee, because it is within her struggles around religious authority that she begins to lay the foundation for how Black women will come to critique where they stand vis-a-vis the vote.
I want to ask you for a moment, in both of these books, about the role of men in historically impeding women's political power. There are always other impediments, but men stand out in both of these narratives quite distinctly. How so?
Well, one of the things that's so amazing is that men really didn't want women to run for office. And there was just no respect. There was no interest and no respect. And I think Elisabeth Perry makes that very clear. But there's something else that really shocked me in her book. She devotes a chapter, it's chapter 4, and it is a chapter about how women are criminalized, prostitutes, vagrants, poor women are arrested. There is, what does she call chapter 4? Let me just, it's quite amazing, but it's a very shocking chapter about how women are routinely arrested. Scandal in the courts. Women are routinely arrested and brought to court on vagrancy charges. Women sitting in Central Park reading are arrested. And they are forced to pay bail, or they are, you know, it is just the most shocking. And that begins this movement among the attorneys, women attorneys and club women, to decriminalize prostitution and to decriminalize poverty. And it's a very, very powerful chapter in her book that we all need to read now. And, you know, why aren't Johns arrested? Why are only the women arrested? But in the 20s and 30s, there's this explosion of the criminalization of women. And I was very shocked by that. So men are not only getting in the way of women running for office, And then you have very powerful women who, as Eleanor Roosevelt once said, I would rather be chloroformed, when people urge her to run for office. I mean, she really had no interest in running for office because women weren't sufficiently organized. Mm. And they shouldn't run for office until they really were organized, so folks had their back and support. And she was kind of right about that. But I think we're more organized now, and it's great that women are running for office. But it's the criminalization of poverty and the criminalization of women, especially single, independent women, which is really, I think, a very shocking aspect to our history.
You know, I think for the women I write about, the story is, well, as we like to say, more complicated. African-American women continue across time to do the work of winning political power, public authority, and voting rights in organizations and institutions that they share with men. And that means within those spaces, in some scenes, men are allies and compatriots. In others, they are adversaries and competitors. But there's no question that for African-American women, as they contemplate the vote in the road to 1920, and then they build a new voting rights movement out of the ashes of the 19th Amendment, African-American women are aware that their fates, their visions, and more are bound up with the circumstances that African-American men face. Black women know they're going to be disenfranchised after the 19th Amendment is ratified. How do they know that? Because their sons and their fathers and their husbands have been disenfranchised increasingly since the 1890s. So by the time we get to 1921 and Black women are looking to build a new voting rights movement, frankly, most white suffragists have moved on. And are not going to remain in the trenches with Black women in an effort to win federal legislation that would give teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendments and overcome Jim Crow laws. And Black women do maintain their distinct organizations, continue to hold up their very high standards for how American politics should be rendered more democratic. And at the same time, they are going to intentionally and deliberately wrestle with men as partners, allies, challenging ones, discouraging ones, but essential ones in that struggle. And the part of the story is precisely the way in which through that movement, women like Constance Baker Motley, who will be a junior member, if you will, of the team founded by Charles Hamilton Houston and then led by Thurgood Marshall. But we know that Constance Baker Motley not only will be an essential member of that litigation team that's chipping away at the edifice that is Jim Crow, she herself is going to run for public office in New York City, go to the New York State legislature, and finally be appointed to the bench. So it's to say, even out of those fraught scenes that are shared with men, part of the story is about how the long game of women's politics means like women like Motley really do emerge as distinct, independent, and powerful political forces.
We have a couple minutes before Q&A and just enough time to perhaps talk a little bit about how both of these historical narratives are informed by family stories, inspired by them, the author's respective grandmothers in particular. We discuss those personal backstories just for a moment and how they inspire and inform these works. Blanche, you're being the surrogate, of course, for Liz Perry, but I know, Martha, this is what made you write this book, is it not?
Yes, well, I'll say, you know, the dust up over New York City's monument in Central Park also played a role, you know, as did this centennial and the prospect that African-American women would be mythologized or parodied rather than, you know, fully formed political actors in this story were important. But it's true that I work in an office at home. I'm sitting here now. This is the beauty of Zoom. And on the wall hang the portraits of the women in my family to whom I am very accountable in my work. And what that meant was that I had to take a detour before I finished this book because I really didn't know where they fit in. But following them, and in particular following my grandmother to North Carolina, where she was living in the 1920s, was an education, because in that state, no one has preserved the records of women's first votes. Can't tell that history with the kind of particularity you would like to. The archives do not give that up, or at least not readily. But I was able to find an interview that she gave many years later in 1978 to historian Bill Chafe at Duke, who was writing a history of civil rights in Greensboro, North Carolina, where she was living. And she recounts not the 20s at all, but the 1950s and 60s and the modern civil rights era. And it is thrilling, as she puts it, to watch now young women engage in that essential, dangerous and courageous work, right, in the grassroots of North Carolina and across the South, pressing Congress and Lyndon Johnson to give up ultimately a Voting Rights Act. And it was an affirmation, in a sense, that in writing a book about Black women in the vote, I could not end in any sense in 1920, because if I did, I would, among other things, miss what for my grandmother really was the pinnacle of that story. And it was the moment of the modern civil rights era. So, yes, it's a story that's very much indebted to those insights that come from the women in my own family past.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
For Elisabeth Perry, she was the granddaughter of Belle Moskowitz. And while Belle Moskowitz never ran for office, she was a creator of women who did run for office. She, you know, she organized the women's division of the Democratic Party. She was the promoter of Frances Perkins. She was one of the authors of the National Labor Relations Act and the Social Security Act. So she was a great force in putting a lot of people together in the 30s. And it's clear that she had a great impact on Elisabeth Israels Perry. As she wrote this book, she's really concerned with all of the women who, you know, it needed, and all of the clubs, all of the organizations, all of the alliances that we need to make change. And she credits Belle Moskowitz for that impact on her life and in her book.
Extraordinary reading about that. But we are now, the chat, the questions are burning up at least my iPad. And let's start with the first one, which is from Martha. I was very moved by Dr. Jones's observation that myth often functions to override history. Is there something about women's history that makes it particularly vulnerable to this impulse?
Well, it's a wonderful question, and it links up to one of the remarks that I often get when I'm out speaking about Vanguard, which goes something like, "Why didn't I learn this in school?" Right. So it speaks to the ways in which myths can oftentimes substitute or fill in the void for those places where we don't have knowledge, we don't yet have knowledge. And so this book has been very much about challenging myths that are not only trouble our sense about the past, but I think are pernicious in our present, which is to say, you know, the notion that the 19th Amendment guaranteed women the vote. Well, what we know in 2020, as vivid as can be, right, is that no American is guaranteed the vote, including American women, even today. And while that might seem like a rather academic lesson, I think we're seeing it vividly played out, right, in our own communities as Americans are, American women, men, all Americans are deeply troubled and uncertain and worse in a critical election year. It's important to put the 19th Amendment, I think, in some more pointed context.
Absolutely. Our next question is for Blanche from our great colleague, historian Linda Kerber. You've been eloquent about men's resistance to women's progressive work, but they did have an important, perhaps indispensable ally in Fiorella LaGuardia. Perhaps you could speak about that aspect of Elisabeth's book.
Well, Elisabeth focuses on all the women in the LaGuardia administration. And there's a picture of all of the women. I think it's in the cover. That many women were in LaGuardia's administration. And I have to say, you know, there are women in, like Eisenhower had his head of health, education, and welfare, Ovida Culpabi. There are men who had women in great, important roles. Ovida Culpabi is important because she, like Eisenhower, they asked Esther Late to support what was going to be a health care for all in the Eisenhower administration in 1957. Again, the AMA lobbied it into what became the Health Reinsurance Act of 1957. But Ovida Culpabi, who some people thought was a Texan and a segregationist, but she was actually a life member of the NAACP. And so you have surprising alliances between Black and white women, between Black and white visionaries. There's one person that I was really sorry that, oh well, we don't have to go there.
Okay.
That's not in the book. There's so many people in the book that are just extraordinary. But
indeed, I'm sorry we didn't get to describe some of these wonderful stories in both of your books, but that's for another salon. We have another question for Martha. Lisa Matterson argues that the political actions and culture of Black women are essential to understanding the politics of Chicago, including why the first successful Black candidate for president came from Chicago and not New York. How does the argument fit with Professor Jones's research?
Oh, well, I count myself among one of the great students of Lisa Matterson and her book. And I've had a chance, in fact, just a few weeks ago to be in conversation with her about Vanguard, which was really an honor for me. But there's no question but that the women's politics, Black women's politics that Lisa Matterson recovers in Chicago in the 20th century is a critical facet of the story. A, because it reminds us that Black women in a city like Chicago, a state like Illinois, are voting and at the polls and making politics, including in the Republican Party, even before 1920, right? In California, New York, and Illinois. And so one of those myths, right, that the 19th Amendment does nothing for Black women. Well, it turns out many Black women didn't have to wait for a 19th Amendment, and Chicago is our prime example of that. But also important out of Lisa's story is, Lisa Matterson's story is insight into what Black women do next. And in a city like Chicago, they continue to work the ground game of American politics despite, right, the threat of disfranchisement in many other parts of the country. And that means that Black women are registering, they are at the polls, they are organized into suffrage clubs and more, and they will send Oscar DePriest, the first African-American man to go to Congress since 1901. In 1928, it is Black women in Chicago who will put DePriest over the top and send him to Washington. So again, it's essential to remember that those Black women who do have access to the ballot are in the ground game 1,000% after 1920, even as they must also contend with the dilemma, the profound dilemma of how to work toward the full enfranchisement of Black women across the American South. So I love Lisa's work and I commend it to everyone.
That's a good question. Then Elisabeth Perry also wrote about Black women. Could either of you introduce them to our audience?
She wrote about so many women. I wrote a little note. She wrote about a lot of women in Harlem, and then she wrote about some wonderful attorneys in Harlem who were wanting to completely rehabilitate the prison system. And those are really extraordinary. There's Marie Lawton, who went to Howard University. She is from Brooklyn, and she works with, she's married to Rufus Lawton, and who is a Presbyterian pastor, and they really work for decriminalizing poverty, welfare programs for children and seniors. There were 103, there was a federation, the Empire State Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and there were 103 clubs that Elisabeth Perry writes about, gives us some sense of what they're doing. And it's just, I mean, this book is filled with just incredible detail and names and activists who did incredible things, all of which need to be done again. I mean, Angela Davis, has given us the hope that we can dispel with prisons now. And there, but this was going on in the 1920s and 30s, this movement to end the imprisonment of people for no reason at all.
This, just as a curator, this question for me, in the exhibition that's currently on view at the New York Historical Society, Women March, it's our 19th Amendment centennial exhibition. We foreground not individual stories so much as the collective action of women marching together, signing petitions, drawing attention to greater causes. But even so, we're seeing some of these wonderful stories that we've never read about in history books coming to light, and seeing certain figures day in the sun. And I wonder how zeroing in on the lives of individuals helps authors further your arguments and tell a more complete and compelling story. I mean, I have some favorites that I've encountered in this period, but are there certain stories that really resonate for you and that truly help you further your arguments?
In African-American women's history, biography has always been at the center of our work. It is not a marginal practice or a literary genre, nor is it the privilege of very senior historians who get their own vanity projects, later on after you've done the serious work at all. And so for me, it wasn't difficult to dive into biography, in part because Black women have too often, I think, in the history of suffrage been either mythologized or parodied. And it was essential to build full characters who inhabited a kind of multifaceted humanity, including a politics, and biography really permitted me to do that. I'll also confess that I think that in a book that really was looking to, frankly, counter works that continue to marginalize African-American women, and Professor Perry's book is not one of them, but those works continue to circulate. There is a terrain that is you know, a tussle over great women's history. And I was in part committed to offering up real women, a pantheon, an alternative to some of the names that are better known to us. It's the way I think my field comes to these questions, but I do think it's also a way in which a public oftentimes looks to come to these questions also.
And I think biography gives us such a sense of what an individual can do within a movement. I mean, how do you survive? How do you deal? How do you negotiate? You know, for me, Eleanor Roosevelt was very useful that way. But the biggest way she was useful was that, you know, she went around the country and around the world wanting to make things better for everybody. And so then you meet Pauli Murray, and then you meet, you know, all of the organizers who want to make things better. And then, I mean, right now, the impact that Flo Kennedy had on our generation of the women's movement. You know, I traveled with Flo Kennedy, Gloria Steinem traveled with Flo Kennedy, so that we were an integrated team when we went places. And that's so important. And I think there's something about right now, Audre Lorde getting the kind of incredible attention that she's been getting. And, you know, we've had several events to celebrate Audre. But the notion that biography has a particular role in history, I've been very proud that because of Eleanor Roosevelt, folks are now saying, okay, we can study biography. It's a reasonable thing to study, when people would dismiss it as, you know, irrelevant to the study of history in the past. So I feel very proud about that.
You should.
Well, yes, indeed. And I am so sorry to tell you that we've unfortunately run out of time. So thank you so very much, Blanche and Martha. Wonderful, wonderful conversation. And thank you to our audience as well for your exceptional support of New York Historical Society. We'll see you all next time. Thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you.